Hi guys, today we are going to talk about the problem set one because you can see that the deadline of submitting problem set one is next week, the end of next week. So this week we are going to talk about the first part from question one to question three, and next week we are going to finish question four, question five. So maybe this video would be very short, but I hope you can listen carefully and so you can submit your homework perfectly. Okay. Now let's get started. Uh, okay. Let's look at this. The first question is when the economy is at the recovery stage, both output gap and growth rate are positive, true or false? So actually, this is only about definition of the recovery stage because as you can see that at the recovery stage, let's use another color, the output gap and growth rate, the growth rate is positive, right? Because now the economy is recovering and it would be a positive growth rate, but actually the output gap is not positive, it's negative. Why? Because remember the definition of the output gap according to the textbook, according to the lecture. It is the actual output subtract the potential output. Again, because it's at the recovery stage. So now the actual output is below the potential output. So now actually this one is negative. So the answer of this question is false because the output gap is negative and growth rate is positive. While in the statement, both output gap and growth rate are positive. This is not true. Okay. Let's look question two. Assume that the input price decrease. Let's think about it without reading the remaining part. If the input prices decreases, which means that the cost of production is decreasing, right? So actually it will increase the aggregate supply because the cost of input is decreasing. So the owner of like the owner of restaurant, it has more motivation to produce more because now the raw materials price is lower than before. Okay, and then the government decides to cut spending. As you know that G is an important part of the aggregate demand, right? So if government decides to cut spending, aggregate demand would decreases definitely if only government decide to cut spending. Okay, now let's look at the question. In this scenario, what would happen to output, the overall price, and the unemployment rate? And you should illustrate these changes on a graph. So let's graph it, and then we can look at what would be the change. First, you need to draw the graph correctly. There, the x-axis is the quantity of output, and the y-axis is the price level. I think you should be careful that the x-axis is the quantity of output rather than the output because in Econ 3, or two, you know that the quantity of output and the output level or output would be quite different. Okay. And then the initial aggregate supply, aggregate supply here, and the initial aggregate demand here. As we analyze this problem before, the AS aggregate supply would increases, right? It would shift left, right. So now the new aggregate supply is here. And what would happen to the aggregate demand? Because the government decided to cut the spending, so the aggregate demand decreases. So now let's look at the difference. The initial equilibrium quantity is here, and the initial equilibrium price here. And then because of the shift of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the quantity level increases, right? And the price, equilibrium price level decreases. So now maybe you would get the answer that, okay, the overall price decreases, the output Y increases, and unknown to the unemployment rate. But actually, what if the aggregate demand changed a lot? It's like that. It's like this. So now the new equilibrium quantity would be lower than before, right? Because Q1 is less than Q. So which means that equilibrium output decreases because of the shift of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So now as you can see that even though the shift of aggregate demand changed a lot, the price also decreases like before. So now, according to these two cases, you can get the conclusion that the price level would decreases definitely, but actually the output, we don't know. We don't know the direction. Maybe because of the change of aggregate demand does not equal to the change of aggregate supply. And which one is larger, which one is more, it will be very important, okay? And also we don't know the unemployment rate. So this is the answer of this question. So firstly, you need to illustrate this graph first, and then according to this graph, give your statement. So do not just like what I did. You need to write some sentence. You need to write your explanation. Okay, and that's for question 2. The remaining question is that please discuss the impact of the monetary policy heading with regards to both unemployment and inflation with respect to the short run and long run. Okay, now we start with the short run. Okay. Actually, the only differences between the short run and the long run regarding the graph is that the aggregate supply is a vertical line or have this have the slope. Okay. If the monetary policy so what does this mean? It means that the interest rate would be higher than before, right? And if the interest rate higher, which means that if you want to borrow money from the bank, the cost would be increases. It would be higher than before. So actually, it would lead to the borrowing cost higher. And also, now, if you are pretty sensitive to the interest rate when you want to borrow money, so maybe some people don't want to borrow money from the bank. So the investment would be less because there are less people borrow money from bank, and the aim of this borrowing is to be the investment, okay? And then it would cause the aggregate demand shift left. Because now the I decreases. If the aggregate demand shift left, it would have a lower inflation. Okay. If the inflation is lower, the unemployment would be higher. Okay. And what would happen in the long run? Because the long run's aggregate supply uh, does not change, and the long run we focus on the expected inflation. So this first part already happened, and what would happen in the long run? Because now the inflation rate is lower than before, right? So actually the expected inflation decreases. If the expected inflation decreases, so the short run aggregate supply shift down. And then maybe you can remember one rule that in the long run, the unemployment rate always goes to the nature rate because the long run would end up the nature rate of unemployment, nature unemployment rate. But with a lower inflation rate. Okay, so I think that's it for this question because in the short run, you can see that it the procedure is complicated than the long run because it would happen to influence the interest rate, the borrowing cost, the investment, and then make the shifting of aggregate demand and then make the inflation rate change, the unemployment rate change. But in the long run, because all the procedure of short run already happened, and so the expected inflation would change, and then because of the aggregate demand in the long run would always be a vertical line. So if the inflation changes, so it can only influence the aggregate supply in the short run. And remember one rule that in the long run, the unemployment rate will always go to its nature rate, if this is a monetary policy. Okay. So I think that's it for today. Next week we are going to have in-person discussion. I hope you can come, but if you can choose one of the three discussion, I will email you guys later at the beginning of next week because I also think 8 a.m. is too early. Bye. Thank you.